this is a Q&A sort of tutorial sort of on how to do balanced tournaments. And this is based on a question that I got from South Africa, from Nigel. Hi, Nigel. Um, and he was basically asking me how what I had seen that was fair. Now, fair for me is a difficult term. I prefer the term balanced. So because fair for who, right? Because we play the game for different reasons. So for me, I prefer balanced. Balanced is for me something where the most players can actually attend. Most players can build the army that they prefer, and it won't be overwhelmingly to the advantage of one type of player, one army. So balance for me is it. So here we go. The question was, you, being a veteran of many international campaigns, must have come across a few tournament rules that you consider to be as fair as possible. And yeah, the problem here is, of course, that the more you tinker with the rules, you're always going to make it unfair for someone else. Like every time you do something to make the game fairer, you just destroy it for someone else. So that's difficult, right? Um, for instance, one thing, the recent Danish nationals, we not me personally, but the EO group wanted to make sure that Gurkhas didn't automatically win the tournament, right? So they made a rule that you can only have two of the same unit. Um, but that meant that, for instance, some minor nations, Polish, couldn't really attend because if you're going to run Polish, the only way you can run Polish and do well is going to be Polish Lancers, like cavalry, right? So that didn't work. Um, so we had to make a lot of exceptions. This was only for major powers, and so every time you tinker with something, you destroy something else. And let me just go through some of the things that you can tinker with. So you can tinker with points. So for instance, if you go low points, so like 700, 500 points, you can fit in a lot more games, which is actually a very nice bonus. Um, but there are some armies that really doesn't work at low points, and there are some armies where if you have free units, if you get free stuff, then that becomes massively more important. So Japanese and French in low points, especially the French, maybe because they can take multiple free units if they run inexperienced units, right? So that becomes a problem in itself. You're empowering them by going down to low points. Now, if you go to high points, the other thing happens. If you go above 1,000 points, 1100, 1250, 1500 points, the armies that can spam veterans are going to do that because they have the points. So they're going to take like 5 units of full strength Gurkhas, or 5 units of 10-man veteran Polish Lancers, right? Because you can. You have the points for that. So so veteran spam becomes the thing if you go to high points. And there are some armies actually, if you're not if you go to high points, and you're not making sure that they can take multiple platoons, there are some armies that can't even do that. For instance, partisans. It's very, very difficult, bordering on impossible, to build a partisan force at 1100 points, 1200 points, if you don't have multiple platoons. It's very, very difficult. It almost is impossible. So in that respect, yeah, that really doesn't work either. So the points is the difficulty. The number of platoons, as I just mentioned, is also a difficulty. Some armies work well in single platoon, and some really don't. There are a lot of minor nations that really doesn't work in single platoon. Um, Greeks, for instance, I'm told by Caspar, really need double platooning to be anywhere near effective. But as soon as you go into dual platooning, double platooning, um, then some things become really overpowered because some nations can take, you know, 2 stewards or 4 multi-launchers or whatever. Once you go into double platooning, so that becomes a problem in itself. There are some things you can't do in a single platoon, but if you go to double platoon, you're allowing for all kinds of other shenanigans. And if you go into multi-platooning, that becomes exponentially more so, right? I have seen tournaments where people ran 3 stewards, or I've even seen one tournament where a player took 7 Katyushas. Um, so I mean, so just like dialing on how many platoons you can take doesn't make it fair and balanced either, and it's a problem that you're going to have to face. What about selectors? We have tank selectors, armored platoons, we have theater selectors, and we have generic reinforced platoons. Until version 3 comes out and this all changes, that is what we have to deal with, right? Um, so which ones are more balanced? I actually don't know. Having played in tournaments that allowed all of them, I can say that that is a bad idea. In tournaments that allowed both tank, theater, and generic reinforced platoons, if those tournaments had single platoons for all of them, then the theater platoons won out. They were massively better represented in the top half than the other 2 types. In uh, in um, in tournaments where you had the ability to multi-platoon generic platoons and single platoon theater platoons and single platoon armor platoons, the armor platoons won out. Um, so the, the balance here is really difficult to get right. I think you need to run events that's just one type of platoon. So tank platoons at tank war events, theater platoons at theater events, and generic reinforced platoons at generic reinforced platoon events. Because I don't think they mix well together. Um, at least that's the sense that I've gotten so far. Um, yeah. And what about the units themselves? That's another problem. What units do you allow? And what units don't you allow? So you can allow, if you're running generic reinforced platoon tournaments, which is mostly what happens here anyway. I know it's different from other places, but here at least we run almost exclusively generic reinforced platoon unit tournaments. Um, then you can do this. You can allow all units that are GRP allowed, generic reinforced platoon allowed. Um, look in the description. I will link you to a list made by one of my teammates with all the units that are allowed in generic reinforced platoons. So that's the thing. But that list is made by Warlord Games and it's slightly not balanced. Um, it's not a list that's trying to be fair to all nations. It's just a list of what they felt like at the time. Um, you can also go like cut way back and say army book units only, but army book units only that also that shifts the meta again in favor of some nations because some nations had really good army books and some nations really didn't. So so that's maybe not balanced either. You can also go and allow certain units that are not normally allowed in whatever platoon you're running, just to balance it out. But then where do you make the cut? And is that cut fair? Most people that like their favorite unit isn't in the allowed units slot will think it's unfair. And so I mean that you're always going to get complaints when you make a cut and allow some units just for balance sake, because some people won't find that balanced. You can also disallow some units for balance, and there's a few certain units that have been disallowed almost all places, and I think are actually pretty like that is fair for balance. I think those units are not supposed to be in platoons because they skewer the game and make it weird in some way. Or you could go everything is allowed, everything that Easy Army does, which when I attended the Spanish Championships a few weeks ago, they had actually done this. And this was actually because newer players really couldn't figure out and didn't have the books what they were allowed to bring. It was really difficult. So with 80 players, the TOs didn't want to be like texting every single player saying, well, that unit is not allowed. Yes, I know it's allowed in Easy Army, but you can't really bring it because it's not marked as generic reinforced platoon allowed. So they didn't want to do that. So they just said, well, everything in Easy Army is allowed. But you know what? Easy Army isn't balanced either. So doing that allowed, for instance, me as Brits to take multi-rocket launchers, land mattresses, which I don't believe really should be allowed. Sorry, there's a helicopter going overhead here. I'm hoping it doesn't disturb you too much. I really don't think that that should be allowed. It makes Brits even more powerful than they already are, and they are powerful. So it isn't balanced, right? Um, so I'm sorry, I'm just listing up problems here. So what do we do? Well, for balance sake, I think the best pack that's out there, link in the description, is actually the pack from the Juggernaught Bold Action podcast. Um, these guys are competitive players, and they've really thought about the pack. However, so for like platoon selection, I think that's the best one. Um, However, that pack, I'm not personally a fan of the missions for the pack. Um, I think they're a little bit limited, and they sort of taste the same a little bit. There's a little bit with how you deploy that feels similar with all the missions. So I think for mission pack, I think you need to go and look elsewhere, potentially. But if you're just running like the Jugger pack for the first event, then use their missions by all means. It's just it's a personal preference for me, where I don't really, yeah, I think the missions are a little bit limited. Anyway, so the Jugger pack, highly recommended. I think it's the best one to go. Now, if you're asking my opinion on what I see should be done with, because this massively changes up how you build platoons. But if you want to run standard Warlord games platoons, then my best bet would be this. I think you should run 1,000 points because it's a nice medium. You could go lower, 800, just because it allows you to have more games a day. But that's a different aspect. It's not for balance, right? And you should allow a single free unit for those armies that can take it. Not multiple free units, a single free unit. I think you should allow double platoons, because that will mean that some of the minor nations are actually you're capable of taking those. And I think you should do generic reinforced only because you shouldn't really mix. And I think generic reinforced platoons are sort of balanced-ish. At least if you go into theater platoons, then some minor nations are not going to work at all. So generic reinforced platoon, best bet. And I think you should go generic reinforced platoon units only. So I know this is a drag, but like you can send out the list and say if your unit is in Easy Army and it's in your army book, then you're good. If it's in Easy Army, um, if it's in your army book and not in Easy Army, then you're good. And if it's in Easy Army and on this list, then you're good, right? So people will have to check. It's a lot more checking, I know, but or you could just buy the books anyway. I think there are some units that you shouldn't allow. So, war correspondents or journalists or whatever they're called, yeah, don't allow those. Um, the naval and siege observers are pretty much disallowed universally. I've been to one tournament where they were allowed and only one player brought them. Hi, Russell. And he absolutely destroyed me with his bombardment. Um, but and it's not like a personal vendetta against naval observers or something. I think they're overpowered. I think they shouldn't be allowed in normal tournament play. Um, and I think stragglers from Case Blue, which could be argued may be generic reinforced platoons. Don't think they're meant to be generic reinforced platoon. They are such a cheap unit that you could spam units of that type, and I don't think you should. So those 3 units I think should be disallowed. Units I think you should allow, though, that are not allowed, and that is for balancing purposes. That is, I think you should allow the Germans access to the Western Desert Schützen. The Schützen are interesting because they can take a single free LMG, and Germany really needs this rebalancing. Um, So you're still paying for the unit, but you get the free LMG and you get Hitler's Bosso on that free LMG. It just boosts Germany quite a bit, and it also gives Germany a very nice type of build, like the camping Germans, um, that they are specialists in, um, which they don't really have without LMGs being a thing in the game. So I think Schützen with a free LMG would be nice for balancing purposes. Um, Potential comp. One thing that I've been thinking about for quite a long time is if I do like comp, if I go in and change the rules for what you can and cannot take, I want to do as little as possible without pissing a lot of people off and making it impossible to do things, right? So I want to do a little bit of rebalancing without changing it so that people will have to buy new armies. And one thing I think you could potentially do that would be an easy rebalancing thing that wouldn't completely rebalance everything is you could say that the obligatory, you have to take 2 infantry units per platoon, right? You could say those 2 infantry units have to be bog standard, regular early war riflemen. Um, 5 to 10 men. You can take them minimum sized if you want to, but that would take away a lot of the spam possibilities, a lot of the possibilities of building like armies that spam out one unit. So, for instance, my all Gurkha unit, all Gurkha platoon that I took to the Spanish championships, right? I had 5 units of Gurkhas. For me, that would have meant that 2 of those selections went away, became regular riflemen. So I had only 3 units of Gurkhas. For people who bring bamboo horde, where you take 5 or whatever units of bamboo, full strength bamboo spearmen, that also means they're going to have to take some riflemen. The Polish lancers, 5 units of lancers, they're going to have to take some regular riflemen as well. Um, the regular riflemen are not bad as such. They're just not taken because people want to spam that one thing. I don't think it would destroy their army builds. I think you could still make assault armies. You could still make like the bamboo horde, but and you could even make like camping Germans, Schützen, 3 Schützen, right? You get 3 free LMGs per platoon, potentially 6 over 2 platoons. But it does mean that you're going to have to take some bog standard riflemen. I think this is an easy fix for a lot of the balancing purposes. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my best bet. Let me know in the comments if you have any other suggestions for what to do. But do remember that every time you twist a dial on something that you can do that could change rules, that could like be a little bit different, you make certain that some armies are not usable anymore, and people are going to complain about not being able to field their, I don't know, Belgians or whatever, right? So, yeah, that was it for me today. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.